The next session, please. It is very gratifying that much of the discussion of the earlier sessions focused on questions regarding not only U.S. policy, but the implications of that policy more globally, and the recognition that science can be done in so many different places with the potential for good and harm, that it really is important to think about how, if there are possibilities for harmonizing policies, regulations, and approaches to the questions of gain of function and other kinds of research. First off, I would like to say we have an extraordinarily distinguished panel, and I wanted to thank each of them for coming long distances to be able to participate in this meeting. Basically, what I would like to have them do, if they would, is to talk about how their agencies, organizations, councils, or countries have thought about this issue and their policies that have been developed, and recognizing that not only are the gains and benefits from biomedical research universal, but so are the risks for the people in different parts of the world who have not contributed to the science or given their permission to do these experiments. So we have both global opportunities and obligations. And so if they would comment on how their organizations and agencies have thought about it, and if they thought there were possibilities for harmonization of those, I would ask, to what extent is whatever policies the NSABB and the United States government agrees upon, to what extent will that be helpful and influential, and to what extent, if there were such defined policies, they think there could be some harmonization. So with that as an introduction, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ruxandra Draghia-Akli from the European Commission, if she would make a presentation of how they've thought about it.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting us to give our perspective, and from my point of view, the European perspective on the issues linked to the gain of function and dual use. So I will start with a very brief presentation of our research and innovation program, because probably many of you are not familiar with the intricacies of that. Then the funding, or to be more precise, the non-funding of the gain of function and dual-use research in this context. The ethics review, which is an intrinsic component of our review, not only for the gain of function and dual use, but by and large for all the projects that are submitted for funding under our programs, and then some considerations related to the member states, the stakeholders in Europe, and their perspective on gain of function and dual use. So Horizon 2020 is a very nice name for the European Union programs for research and innovation for the period of 2014 to 2020. It has a budget of about 80 billion euros, and indeed it has a rationale that research and innovation is very complex. This program is not addressing issues that can be addressed at the national level, but rather a part is looking at funding similar to the National Science Foundation in the United States, and the big other part is in fact collaboration programs, transnational multidisciplinary programs. So in this overarching program, we don't have one or another country exclusively, but the 28 European countries and then the associated countries to the program. So to put it a little bit in the perspective, in the EU, overall, we have approximately 3/4 of the US total for federally funding R&D. But if you're looking at how that is distributed, in fact, the collaborative Horizon 2020, so the program that is managed at the union level, is relatively small. By comparison, the member states program, so each and every one, if you put them head to head, represent the bulk of the funding for research and innovation. Each of them having their own funding agencies with their national rules and regulation legislation that in fact is adapted to the national legislation by and large. So if we are looking at how the budget breakdown in the program of research and innovation is done, you will see that a big part is linked to what we are calling societal challenges, from which the health, demographic change and well-being, so the part that is linked to biomedical research, is the biggest. But there are also another number of components of the program, for instance, excellence science or the industrial leadership, that can be touched by issues of gain of function or dual use. So if we are looking actually at the EU-funded research in this area, I need to start by saying that the purpose of the European R&D is always for civil purposes, health use. So military or malevolent use is always either not intended at all in the program or is an unintentional byproduct. So we do not have actually specific calls where this gain of function or dual use are spelled out. Nevertheless, we do have a lot of the topics, research that is in the area of prediction, of identification, of modeling, of surveillance of newly emerging infectious diseases in humans, as well of the zoonotic infections and the background and related strategies. So we have undertook an analysis of the current 1,000+ programs and projects that we do have in the portfolio, and it turned out that, in fact, only about 3 projects has been identified of having components that are linked to the gain of function. So those are, in fact, by and large platforms. One is linked to the management for emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. Another one is linked to the preparedness, prediction, and prevention of emerging zoonotic viruses with pandemic potential. And then we do have a project looking at the global onset of novel epidemics. So these are older projects, if you wish, projects that have started, as you're seeing, around 2009-2011. In the current program, we don't have any new projects that have been launched in this area. Nevertheless, we are prepared, and we have watched very closely the discussion that was undertaken at the global level, and in particular here in the United States, and our ethics reviews is quite nimble into detecting such potential issues. So during the proposal preparation, so in the guidance for the applicants, they are asked if the proposal has an exclusive civilian focus on research, and if their research uses or produces goods or information that will require export licenses in accordance to the legislation on dual-use items. All the proposals that are submitted are going first to an ethical screening screening. So they are looked upon by independent panels of specialists if they are addressing all the ethical issues. And these specialists are coming from very different backgrounds. So it's not exclusively medical doctors or PhDs. There are also, as we've heard before, attorneys, philosophers, and patient representatives that are looking at each and every one of these proposals. And then those proposals that have been identified of containing elements where we have to move a little bit forward with our analysis, not only for gain of function or dual use, but also for stem cells, complicated issues linked to clinical trials or with animal experimentation. They are going to full ethical assessment, so which means that each and every one of these proposals are going to be evaluated by at least 5 ethics experts coming from this very diverse background. So at the end of the process, we are categorizing the proposals into different categories. So we have proposals that are cleared so they can continue, and then they are evaluating on the science. We do have a conditional clearance, so we are asking the applicants for additional materials that should be submitted, including those that are required by their national legislation, for instance, permits, or they do not pass this evaluation, so do not get the clearance, and then simply those projects are not funded. In fact, even in the model grant agreement, which is a contractual agreement with the applicants, it is very clearly stated that all the research has to comply with a EU national or international law. So it, in a very direct manner, is putting the burden of proof on the applicants, including the host institution for those particular projects. Because the EU is a very complex, it's a very complex setting, and I'm sure that all the other speakers are going to point to this issue. We do respect what is called the subsidiarity principle, which is that the national research funding is the national responsibility. We don't interfere into that. But of course that the regulations at the EU level have to be respected, including their implementation in the national legislation. So for instance, we do have an EU-wide regulation on export control, which is looking at all the components of technology transfer. So here I'm not talking exclusively about materials, but also, again, as we've heard before, information linked to this, to the research that is undertaken. So the different scientific communities have looked at the problem of gain of function very differently. So at the end, the tiebreaker was the European Academy Science Advisory Council, and I'm very sure that you will have a wonderful presentation after mine related to their findings. So we have looked at how the stakeholders would view these experiments. And all the stakeholder consultation has acknowledged the fact that we need to improve the awareness, to share the best practices among the members of the scientific community, and to promote this culture of responsibility, given not only the potential for accidental release and misuse, but recognizing the fact that we are dealing with 28 different legislation that we had to have and find common grounds. So we have embraced the recommendations of the European Academy of Science Advisory Council, which I'm sure that they're going to be developed. I'm just going to focus on one, because Barry challenged us to give a response to the problem of global collaboration, which is that we do really believe that an international forum is needed to sustain the dialogue between the life sciences and the policymaker communities with the other stakeholders' involvement. So I'm talking not only about the fact that this legislation at the European level provides a framework, a little bit like a global framework in Europe, but that has been transposed in practical terms, probably not identical in each and every one of the member states. So we do have to find this common ground. And I'm taking 3 examples of 3 member states that have implemented the processes differently. That does not mean that the standards are not at the highest level. So for instance, in the United Kingdom, in the research institutions, the scientists must assess themselves the risks of their experiments. Of course, the universities will ensure the training, will have the equipment, the facilities that are suitable for the proper experimentation, and they would submit their research proposals to the local biological safety committee. So it's the equivalent of the institutional safety committees in the American universities. These biological safety committees will be composed of members that have the appropriate knowledge, they have the expertise and the experience to assess the proposals. And again, they do not come exclusively from life sciences. In Europe, this dialogue with the society at large is very well established, and we always have not only the attorneys, but really the civil society involved in the assessment of the experiments. For work that is requiring highly secure facilities, all these proposals, recommendations must also be submitted to the senior management of the institution. And then the accepted proposals will be submitted to the health and safety executive with the purpose of this notification of intention to conduct individual contained use activities. So it is a rather complicated process, but you know, hearing you from this morning, I don't think that is more or less complicated than what we have heard. I think that with practice and with the analysis case by case of these proposals, research can in fact continue. In the Netherlands, of course, this has been one of the points of contention as of the last few years. The responsibility lies first with the researchers, but also with the host institution. Again, we do have the special facilities, the procedures, we have the training of staff, but this time around they are directly supervised by the biosafety office. All the proposals are first submitted to the biosafety office, who is looking both at the wild-type pathogens and the GMOs. I'm not going to enter into a long description of the GMO regulation in Europe. It's quite complex, but fortunately or unfortunately, researchers would also have to comply with those rules. And then we do have this element of training. The proposals are then checked by inspection services of the relevant ministry. Again, some of the measures that have not been mentioned here today are, for instance, that in the difficult cases, there are formal scientific opinions which are made public and receive a formal permit from the ministry that is based on the WHO guidance. For all the researchers that are undertaking this type of experiments, we are practical, so vaccination is compulsory if effective vaccines are available. Last but not least, I took the example of France because there the supervision is done by a national agency for safety of the drug and health products. So all the persons who are conducting operation involving the use of human pathogens or toxin on the toxic microorganisms must hold an authorization from this specific body. So this time around, you start from the top, from the ministry, and not from the researcher or the institution. And this control of the use of the microorganism is related to their belonging in the lab. So the simple fact that you have it in the lab, it has to be regulated, irrespective if you are going to attenuate it or make it more virulent. There are quite a large number of limitations and control to access, for instance, for foreign persons in the sensitive laboratories. So from these three examples, you can see that, in fact, in the different European countries, this EU large regulation has been implemented differently. So I'm not going to dwell onto each and every one of the member states. It turns out that quite a number of them have no rules, just the general framework. But my point is that in general, we are dealing with case by case. We do not have a long list of very, very specific definitions and patterns that we will use in each and every one of the cases, and that, in fact, the variability is also introduced by the various member state legislation. Our researchers will have to comply with all of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'd like to call on now Dr. Volker Meulen, who represents the European Academy of Sciences Advisory Council.
Thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the possibility to summarize a report which the European Academy Science Advisory Council has prepared. Let me first explain to you what is EASAC. Dr. Draghia has already referred to it, that we are an advisory council and giving advice to policymakers at the EU Commission and the EU Parliament. This European Science Advisory Council was actually formed in 2001, and it represents all science academies of the European member states, with the exception of Malta, Luxembourg, and Cyprus, because they don't have national science academies. And the objective of this council is to take issues which are of importance for society and for politics and prepare them in a way that the administrators in the EU Commission, but also the parliamentarians in the EU, are really getting informed about important issues and topics which they should be informed before they vote. You must know that, for example, in Europe, the European Parliament and the European Commission have tremendous influence of the national governments. And about 70 to 80% of all decisions made in these bodies have a science background. In addition to these member states, we do have the science academies of Norway and Switzerland, the secretariat and the headquarters of my academy in the Leopoldina in Germany in Halle, and the basic areas in which we give advice is biosciences and health, environment and energy, and of course also in the area of infectious diseases. Now, we were asked by the EU Commission and by the previous chief scientific advisor in Glover 1.5 years ago to deal with the issue of gain of function experiments due to the fact that, like in the United States, in Europe, the society was concerned about the experiments which were really carried out in the United States and in the Netherlands. And we were asked to try, to advise the EU Commission and make a report and recommendation and statement. And in contrast, what you have heard today, the very impressive analysis and document by the NSABB and by the colleagues who did a detailed analysis of influenza risk and benefits situation, we actually prepared and tried to bring a consensus report to the EU Commission and to the Parliament in a way that they would understand what is at stake. They would understand the problems, and they could see in which way the science community would deal with these problems. So this is not a report which is similar to the reports you have seen today, which are very impressive. It's more a report in a way how you advise policy makers. Now, what we did, of course, was bringing together in the working group, first of all, colleagues who had a different opinion about the issue. And you may recall that in the European newspaper for a period of time there were really controversial issues constantly bringing up on the front page. So we brought these two groups, the European Virology Group and the European Vaccinologists, together around a table, in addition with influenza experts, with people from biosafety, biosecurity, ethics colleagues, etc. And we dealt and tried to find out, is there a consensus report possible? Also wanted to clarify the issues which are still unresolved and to advise on what additional analysis is needed to assess future options for the research area. And of course, we also was dealing with the EU regulation, and you just have heard that they are different in different member states, but the majority of all these states do have, certainly for this type of experiments, some sort of government body which has to be consulted and which has to give permission to do such an experiment. So the first meeting took place in November. Then we had several meetings afterwards, and we presented our report in 2015. And what we wanted to do is, of course, to address a number of audiences. In the first place, the audience was the EU Commission and the EU Parliament. Then, of course, the academies of sciences as member states, because the advantage is that the science academy of our member states have good contacts to the national government, and in this national government, of course, they would really have an impact. Let me just say one word about the advantage of having a consensus report, because our report was not only be approved by all the working group, but also by all science academies of the European member states. My experience is when a politician who comes from one of the member states knows that his own science academies has approved the document which we have prepared, then the politician feels much more comfortable when his own country had a look at the report which has been written. This is different in your country, where you are one country and where you can really decide for the entire country, and not in Europe, where you have 28 different member states which have a different opinion in many, many aspects. So what did we address? So we tried, of course, to address issues which we have talked today about it. Self-governance and scientific responsibility. We had a long discussion about benefit risk assessment, of course, and I was very impressed today to listen to this presentation by the colleagues, how they have analyzed in detail the different influenza strain in relation to the benefit and risk. Of course, we did a research review and management system. We also talked about the pro and the con of a moratoria and alternatives. Bioethics was a big issue, biosecurity and advisory issues, mechanism and advisory bodies. Of course, publication was an issue, because you probably may have heard that in the Netherlands, the government stepped in and did not approve for a certain period of time the publication which the Dutch colleagues wanted to publish on their gain-function experiments. And of course, global context, how to inform discussion and action-wide work, but I hope that tomorrow we have a possibility to discuss about harmonization, with Barry Bloom already mentioned the possibility how eventually, not only in Europe and the United States, we find the basis in how to handle this type of experiments, but we certainly need more. If we want to achieve something, it has to be done. I have to try how much we can achieve globally in countries in which such experiments are carried out. So in the following slides I'm presenting to you, I would like to describe what we see as a layered approach to the responsibility and action in the view of EASAC, emphasizing the need to adopt this layered approach because we think this will help to spread good practice, increase accountability, improve public trust, which I think is very important in research, and of course also documents that the science community itself has concerns about these experiments. We feel it is fundamentally important, first and foremost, that countries, their research institutions and researchers follow the rules and guidance already in place as a result of established legislation and experience. We are focused on virology because this was the issue we were asked to deal with, but we feel that our recommendations, of course, are also applicable, as we have heard today with many examples, the different sessions that is broadly in microbiology research. And we agree, what I can say as what we have heard from NSAAB interim conclusions, that all life sciences as well, of course, research with specialism, have a certain risk depending on the question which will be dealt with a scientist. My final crucial points on the slides, EASAC usually tries to produce, as I said, a consensus report, and I already explained why consensus is important for us. So what are the EASAC key messages on self-regulation and harmonization? All scientists, of course, have to accept responsibility for the safety first of all, of themselves, but their colleagues and the country at large. And self-regulation is a necessary first step, but that does not mean that each researcher is free to decide for himself what procedures to follow. Self-regulation means that there are checks and balances within the scientific community. Our EASAC report describes several examples of self-regulation and the opportunities for harmonizing procedures to spread good practice in research, design, review, and management. Attention to key biosafety issues is imperative at all stages of the research endeavor, from the very beginning when already formulating a research idea. Grant applicants should discuss the potential risk involved in proposed experiments, and funders should consider on a case-by-case basis whether research proposals have scientific merit and whether the research can be safely conducted. Our EASAC recommendations are consistent with the recommendation published by the NSABB Working Group in December, that in general, oversight mechanism for GOF studies of concern should be incorporated into existing policy frameworks where those represent best practice. We also agree with the NSABB recommendation that governments should continue their efforts to strengthen biosafety and biosecurity to foster a culture of responsibility for all research involving pathogens. Benefit risk assessment. I mentioned already that this is a very complicated and difficult issue, and we tried our best to discuss this, of course, and find a way in which we could really go forward. I still recall the meeting we had in December or the end of November last year, where some of you were already in Hanover at the Volkswagen Foundation, where we discussed the possibility, can we find some sort of an equation, are there metric measurements in which one can really define risk and benefits. And of course, it is an issue which is, as we heard today, so specific and so difficult in defining and leading to a way that I must say that for the influenza virologists, it could not be better be presented as we have heard today. So views have varied, of course, also among our working group on GOF research. And the question was, should it be quantified as near future gains to public health or described in terms of the generation of new knowledge? In either case, it is difficult to quantify benefits, as I mentioned, as in a metric way that allows amount of benefits to be compared directly with amount of risk. Risk assessment in itself is a very challenging task, as exemplifies very well in the comprehensive Griffin report we heard this today. What we emphasize in our EASAC report is the need for benefit and risk assessment to be a continuing collective commitment to understand and share the issues. Our message here is also similar to the NSABB one, that risk-benefit profile needs to be reevaluated over time. However, it is also important for us all to address other questions. For example, who should be doing the assessment, and how should their subjectivity be taken into account? And how should the results of assessments then be taken into account in informing policy development and strategic decisions? How about key messages at the national activities and organization? One key topic of the discussion in Europe during the last couple of years has been, does the EU, through its European Commission, require a new advisory or regulatory body to deal with these matters for research of concern? As you know, in the EU, research can be funded and conducted at the national level, and as we heard already at the previous speakers, in addition, collaborative research can be funded by the EU Commission currently through its Horizon 2020 program. EASAC recommended that there is no need for a new advisory body on biosafety and or biosecurity at the EU level, so we have many regulations in place, but we heard the most important problem is that really these regulations are really put into operation in all member states, and there may be some problems which have to be addressed. But you got a good example how it is done in the UK or in the Netherlands or in France, and in a similar way it is done in Germany, I can tell you. However, we also recommended that all the countries who make up the EU should have a clear national advisory and governance mechanism on procedures for assessing and managing biosafety and biosecurity risk. The point that I want to emphasize here is the EASAC recommendation that the mechanism at the national level should have some sort of legal powers. In order to ensure this happens consistently across the EU, it is now a task for our EU countries to share and implement good practice with regard to national oversight as part of the layering of the roles and responsibility that I mentioned earlier. So, how does EU currently manage research? I mean, you have heard there are different, and I don't have to go into detail on the slide, there are the different directives which has been presented by Dr. Draghia. And these regulations are also then, in addition, be accompanied by WHO and OECD guidance, which develop of ISO standard. And I'm sure we will hear about this later on. And of course, there's the code of conduct, which is also described by different research organizations, the Max Planck organizations, the Leopoldina, etc. And I had included a documentation of how it is done in England. You heard this. And there are actually 3 layers: the infrastructure, the institution assessment, the health and safety executive. And Dr. Draghi has given you some more details, so I can skip this. How about publication? Now, publication, of course, is an important issue. And I mentioned already that there has been some problems in Europe, you know, for the publication of what the Dutch research group tried to publish when they had their first publication. And this was stopped actually by the so-called European Commission Export Control Regulation, which we feel is inappropriate and ineffective vehicle to block publication. Unfortunately, we have not discussed here during the debate today, but maybe tomorrow, about what is the best view about publication of such sensitive issues. How should we deal with it? And of course, if an experiment is done in which all safety measurements are really taken and defined, at the end, I think things could be published. But if there are data coming out which are very sensitive, I think it is a question which has not been really solved yet. Public engagement is an important aspect which we feel trust and openness, I think, are crucial for researchers and the institutions. And I think academies and others in the scientific communities have a responsibility, have to try to get a public dialogue and be open. And we have discussed this already today in different panels in some details. And of course, EASAC is committed to do this also in the future. So if I conclude, we have made a recommendation for the EU Commission and the EU Parliament and the Member States. And it was quite interesting to note, if I summarize, that after we had this consensus report and after it has been distributed in the EU, in the science academies, and they have been active, the controversial discussion in our newspapers ended. And this, I think, is at least some positive effect we could achieve. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that. In a world in which consensus on anything at a policy level seems so remote, you've done a terrific job of achieving that, at least in this area of science. Let me turn now to Dr. Silja Voneky at the German Ethics Council. If she would speak to us, and you can stand if you wish, or sit.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very grateful to be here and to be part of this symposium. And I have to say that I'm really impressed by the efforts that are made by the NSABB and the National Academies of Sciences and the government here in the US to get the full picture of gain-of-function research and how to govern it in a justified way. I will present the German Ethics Council recommendation on these topics, and more accurately, it was a report on biosecurity, freedom and responsibility of research that was issued 2014, and you can find an English translation in the internet on the Council's website. The German Ethics Council is an interdisciplinary independent council of experts whose 26 members are appointed by the President of the German Parliament, and concerning the biosecurity opinion, the Federal Ministries of Research and of Health ask the Ethics Council to investigate whether we are sufficiently prepared with respect to the misuse of research from the biological sciences. And according to this task, we mainly look to solve the problem of biosecurity. Biosecurity aims, as you all know, to prevent the intentional misuse of gain-of-function research or gain-of-function research results. Biosafety, on the other hand, aims to prevent the accidental release. We dealt with questions of biosecurity, and the deeper reason behind this is that there are many more laws in Germany that govern biosafety concerns, for instance, laboratory safety standards, than enhance biosecurity. Nevertheless, we are not stating that there's a dichotomy between the areas of biosecurity and biosafety. Quite to the contrary, means to ensure biosafety can promote more biosecurity and vice versa. And before I come to the main part of my presentation and lay out the 5 recommendations for future governance of gain-of-function research, please allow me to stress a few other results from the report of the Council. First of all, we found that it's in coherence with the precautionary principle in a very soft version, not the version you find here in the US. So the precautionary principle in a very soft version that measures to evaluate and reduce the risk of gain-of-function studies of concern have to be taken by the states, even if we cannot know or quantify the risk of the occurrence of damage. This means even in low or unknown probability high-risk scenarios. The same result can be derived from legally binding basic rights, as they are part of the different constitutions of states and the international human rights treaties. This is the case since the fundamental rights of the researchers, the freedom of research, may be restricted in a proportional manner for legitimate aims, and the state must protect the fundamental rights to life and health of the individuals and the public. However, we found that the existing legal rules that govern gain-of-function research in Germany and in Europe are not fully sufficient nor coherent. They either encompass only limited areas of biosecurity, or they target special questions of biosafety, like the German genetic engineering law. One striking example is that according to European Union law, and it was mentioned, a publication in the area of biosecurity relevant gain-of-function research only needs a permit from the export authorities if it's published in a journal outside the European Union. Another example is, I think, research funding, because within the European Union framework programs for research, the Horizon 2020, there are no specific restrictions for funding gain-of-function studies of concerns. Hence, there are quite significant gaps in the legal framework at the international, European, and national level concerning gain-of-function research. Having said this, I come now to the main part of my presentation, where to go from here and what are the Council's recommendations for the future governance of gain-of-function research. Our view is that we should focus on 5 different areas of governance. The first aim should be to raise the level of awareness of questions of biosecurity in the scientific community. The second level targets the elaboration of a national biosecurity code of conduct. The third area governs research funding. The fourth area displays recommendations for regulation in Germany. And the fifth names European and international initiatives. All these recommendations do intertwine. Biosecurity and biosafety is a problem that can neither only be solved by self-regulation nor on a national level. So the first recommendation targets raising awareness in the scientific community itself. And the idea is to promote, and this is very kind of straightforward, to promote a culture of responsibility and improve the knowledge of researchers in the life sciences. Therefore, questions of biosecurity should be integrated into the undergraduate and graduate curricula. Secondly, the Council recommends the elaboration of a national biosecurity code of conduct that defines the responsible manner of dealing with problems of biosecurity. Such codes are useful instruments of self-regulation, and standards that extend beyond legal obligations should be established in the code. This means that the following concrete obligations, according to the Ethics Council, concrete obligations to minimize risk should be enshrined in the code. So research programs should be examined in order to establish whether the benefits are sufficient to justify taking the risk involved, and there's broad consensus, I think. However, this is not a mere risk-benefit evaluation, since it's of particular importance for the researcher to examine whether the research carries an unreasonably high risk for protected rights, such as the life or health of people, and perhaps we can discuss why this is not only risk-benefit. Should such an examination reveal that there's an unreasonably high risk for protected rights, then the research should not be pursued. The same applies with respect to publication and research cooperation programs. And in addition to this general standard, a subgroup of the Ethics Council, including myself, agreed that it's decisive that the Code of Conduct should contain an additional threshold for gain-of-function studies of concern. This should be the case for those experiments for which it's foreseeable that the pathogenic effect of a microorganism will be enhanced in such a manner that the danger of an epidemic of a severe disease for humans is given. Such experiments should not be undertaken unless a direct, concrete, and overwhelming benefit for the protection of humans against dangers to life or health is probable. This is a decisive threshold, I think, since otherwise the potential damage outweighs the potential benefit of the research program. Moving to the third recommendation, which concerns the area of research funding. With respect to funding of gain-of-function research, it should be ensured that the scientist entrusted with the project management has agreed to comply with the new code of conduct we propose. Research programs that are not justifiable after risk-benefit assessment or do not meet the special gain-of-function studies of concern threshold should not be funded. However, whether this is the case cannot be decided by the researcher or the funding party if we have experiments that pose high risks. They should previously be assessed by a new federal oversight body, the so-called Dual Use Research of Concern Commission, or DURC Commission, which has to be established for this purpose. And this new commission should take consultative votes. Consultative votes is not a permit procedure. To DURC-relevant experiments in Germany, and their votes should decide on the research funding on a dual-use research of concern. So dual-use research of concern should be defined in coherence with the international discussion as research that has significant potential to give rise to knowledge, products, or technologies which could be directly misapplied as weapons of mass destruction. And here you see, I think, that the notion of dual-use research of concern overlaps to a certain amount with the NSABB notion of gain-of-function studies of concern. This new commission is an important part of the fourth recommendation as well. Here the recommendations for new regulation which the Council advocates are summarized. The Commission must, in the Council's view, be an independent, interdisciplinary commission that should include life sciences and security experts, as well as biosecurity expertise from civil society. And up to now, we do not have such a commission in Germany or Europe. We also recommend to lay down a legal obligation of researchers to consult the Commission before conducting dual-use research of concern. Furthermore, the Commission should consult on further measures for reducing risks, monitor DURC experiments, and evaluate research cooperations and publications of DURC outcomes. However, and this is a quite easy misunderstanding, the Commission should not evaluate all gain-of-function research that is carried out in Germany, but instead only those studies that fall into the area of dual-use research of concern. As only dual-use research of concern should be regulated, in the Council's view, a more precise definition is necessary. In our recommendation 4.1, and it's page 184 of the English translation of the report, 10 groups of research experiments are listed which, considering the international discussion pose the greatest risk. For instance, work intended to enhance the harmful consequences of listed agents. But these experiments are dual-use research of concern if and only if they are done with certain dangerous agents. So hence the German Ethics Council recommends a multi-layered approach for the regulation. First, we propose a definition of dual-use research of concern included in an Act of Parliament. Second, it's important to specify this definition and define certain groups of experiments that should be listed in a statutory ordinance or regulation, if you want to call it. And third, we see the need for a list of agents that is determined by the new Commission itself. It's necessary that the list of agents has to be kept up to date in accordance with the new knowledge in the life sciences, and therefore the list of agents shall not be part of the legislation, but agreed upon by the new Commission so that it can be modified if necessary. And these are the four essential recommendations for the domestic area: raising awareness, second, a biosecurity code of conduct, third, special rules for research funding, and fourth, the establishment of a federal oversight commission and federal consultation procedure for studies of concern. And having said this, I want to stress as well that it would be a misconception to assume that the freedom of research is disproportionately restricted if legal regulations beyond the code of conduct are laid down. Codes and legal regulations complement each other. Codes of conduct can be useful instruments of self-regulation, but they do not have democratic legitimacy. Hence, in the areas of research that pose greatest risk, only there, the legislator must decide on how to balance the fundamental rights. Law-based regulations do not violate the freedom of research. On the contrary, it's an acknowledgement of the significance of the affected basic rights, the freedom of research on the one side, and the duty to protect life and health of the population. I come to the fifth and last recommendation of the Ethics Council, and this refers to European and international initiatives. Certainly, standards at the international or at least European level are generally the most appropriate for solving the biosecurity and biosafety problems connected to gain-of-function research. Therefore, the following is recommended. The discussion within the scientific community concerning the possible benefits and risks of gain-of-function should continue to be pursued in order to reach a consensus on what constitutes responsible research. One should also try to agree on a code of conduct on a European or even international level. At the European level, states should advocate that gain-of-function research is only funded according to the previously mentioned criteria, and that uniform standards are established for this kind of research in the member states. Furthermore, states should strive for an internationally binding definition and classification of dual-use research of concern, or if you prefer the notion gain-of-function studies of concern, including uniform laboratory safety classifications. It's not convincing, in my view, for biosecurity and for biosafety if in one country certain high-risk gain-of-function experiments can be performed in laboratories with safety classifications 2 or 3, but in other countries they only can be performed in a few laboratories with safety classifications 4. Lastly, the Council sees lacuna in the current international treaty regime, and international treaty law does not regulate in a sufficient way the specific biosafety and biosecurity problems. The bioweapons and the chemical weapons conventions are relevant, important treaties, but have too many gaps in regard to research aimed towards peaceful purposes. And therefore, states should strive for the conclusion of a treaty that defines the fundamental principles and limitations of gain-of-function research, or, as a first step, at least an international soft law declaration. And I think a good example for a quickly negotiated, in 15 months only, soft law declaration which is relevant to research is the UNESCO Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights from 2005, which consists of 28 articles and links ethical principles to international human rights. I think we could do this here as well. And this leads me to my conclusion. Our goal, the Ethics Council goal, was to propose a clear, hopefully clear, coherent, but nevertheless flexible governance system for reasonable standards of gain-of-function research that is open to future developments and balances the freedom and responsibility of research. And there neither may be disproportional limits to research, nor shall possibilities for risk minimization be neglected. It's certainly difficult to assess the prospects of success of our recommendations. Up to now, the German Federal Ministry of Research tries to solve the problem of gain-of-function research and dual use by relying on the self-regulation code of conduct issued by the DFG, it was mentioned, the largest research funding organization in Germany, and the Leopoldina. This, however, is a very broad dual-use code of conduct. It's a very important code of conduct, but it's a broad dual-use code of conduct, giving recommendations for handling security-relevant research, and it's covering not only natural sciences, but, for instance, legal scholars as well. The code has to be implemented by the different research institutions and universities, and up to now I know of 6 universities and 6 other research institutions which have adopted this code and set up special ethic commissions to implement it. Apart from this, I had the impression when I was attending the Bioweapons Convention meeting in Geneva 2014, and when I left Germany last summer to go to Boston, Harvard, that the German Foreign Office is interested in the topic of how to deal with biosecurity-relevant research and existential risks in a broader sense, and would support an international initiatives in this field with like-minded states. I will have a meeting next Friday in Berlin at the Foreign Office, and I could tell more after this, not today, I'm sorry. But thank you very much for your attention so far. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much. An enormous amount of thought and effort is going into things in Europe, which is enormously gratifying. Let me ask for our fourth speaker, Keiji Fukuda, to come to the platform. Dr. Fukuda was Assistant Director General at WHO for Human Security and Special Advisor, if I remember, on influenza, which he knows a great deal about.
Thank you, Dr. Bloom. And I want to thank both the NSABB and also the Academy for the invitation to the meeting. It's really a pleasure to be here. And in return for that pleasure, I have a very short talk, and it's only 4 slides. That's the last day. If we can go to the next slide. So I think that one perspective that I wanted to add is to give you a little bit of a context about why I asked some of the questions that I did earlier in the morning. But I think that this meeting is focused on one of the issues related to genetic technologies, but in fact there are other issues which are out there. So for example, here we are looking very much at how one may approach gain-of-function studies, what is the potential for harm, and at the global level it's really a broader sense of harm rather than just dual use in terms of information, which is a concern. But for example, WHO has been asked formally by a country to address the issue of synthetic biology in relationship to smallpox viruses. So on the one hand, if we have gain of function as modifying current organisms, synthetic biology can be looked at gain of organism. It is really not a difference in concept, but it is a difference in application, which is really bears some thought. Now, I think out of these discussions, you know, many of the recent discussions in 212 and 213 and since then, including in the area of gain of function and with synthetic biology, have highlighted one of the facts that we can talk a lot about laboratories for whom regulations will be meaningful. And in fact, there are a lot of biosafety, biosecurity mechanisms and regulations put in place. But one of the realities that we have to look at is that we are dealing with the phenomenon that technology is getting cheaper. Do-it-yourself laboratories are a reality in many parts of the world. And if we are thinking about outcome, it doesn't really matter whether something new comes from a laboratory or from a garage or something. And that is part of the broader issue. But in addition to that, a lot of these issues are raised from the perspective of human health, which you know, for many of us is paramount. But there are other perspectives and there are other initiatives. So if we look at something called the Nagoya Protocol, in fact, from the environmental world, there has been a great deal of effort going into something called the Convention on Biological Diversity, which has its own secretariat, its own member states. And as part of that, there is something which was agreed upon by countries called the Nagoya Protocol, and it is now in force. And in effect, what it says is that the movement of viruses ought to come under things such as prior consent. So there should be agreements on viruses moving. And one of the immediate questions which has come up is, well, how does that work in terms of outbreaks or emergencies? How do you handle those kinds of situations? And I think right now the answer is nobody is quite sure. It hasn't been tested, it hasn't been brought up, and it hasn't really been worked through. But I know that for my colleagues in the EU, the member states there, and for a number of other countries, it is of concern. How does all of this fit together? In addition, some of you may know something called the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework, but that framework also was focused very much on the movement of viruses, but more recently has focused on the question of the movement of genetic sequence information. And so again, these are not exactly the same issues. And one of the practical questions, though, is to what degree are they linked? How does the world address them? Do you address them one by one? Do you try to bundle them in some sort of way? And if you do, how do you bundle them? And I think one of the key issues here is that when we look at the broader range of concerns, there are scientific concerns, health concerns, security concerns, but they are also broader social concerns. And all of these discussions take place in a broad social context, and the connections between these issues are not the same at one perspective versus another, and it makes it, I think, complex. Next slide. Or am I controlling it here? Sorry. So I think that all of those issues at the global level are in one way or the other, quite important and critical, but in fact there's little global awareness about them. There's not that much understanding of what are the implications of them, how do they fit together, and there is certainly no clear strategy right now about how to address them. So as I mentioned, can these kinds of issues be addressed one by one in a meaningful way, or in fact, do you have to look at them as linked issues and try to come up with a broader approach to the solution? And I think this is critical at the policy level. The policy considerations will not be exactly the same as the technical considerations. So if we look at global discussions, I put down that they usually broaden. The more people talk together, the more they meet, the more things come on the table, and discussions get bigger, the scope of things simply gets bigger. So if we look at risk assessment, this is, when it is well done, it is very much a scientific and technical issue. The methodology for this is pretty well worked out, and it can be a precise discussion. And so frequently we talk about risk assessment and risk management, but from my perspective, there's really something in between, which is the perception and the tolerance of risk. And so when we look at risk perception, tolerance, and management of what to do, these become very much cultural issues, they are political issues, they are consensus-based agreements at the global level. These are different than pure scientific discussions, but that is how policy is developed, and these are the things which have to be taken into consideration when you are thinking about what can we do. Oh, I think I killed it. Okay, I think this is my last slide. So options for going forward. So practically speaking, what do you do? What do you do in this kind of situation? What are the options which are really out there? Well, I think that for the international organizations, and certainly WHO, we are in the position to convene countries, parties, experts, bring them together. And I think that in terms of looking at the technical aspects of these issues which we are dealing with, it is certainly possible to think about convening, and in doing so, framing out what are the issues, what may be the principles in terms of approaching them. I think that there is confusion on definitions and terminology. You know, we're talking about gain of function or gain of function of concern or dual use. And so all of these have different meanings for people. I think these kinds of things can be worked out. A second kind of approach to this sort of problem is implementing what may be considered WHO programmatic activities. And so, for example, some of the ways in which we look at how laboratories and companies handle things, there is a process called pre-qualification, which differs depending on the product, which differs depending on the companies that we are dealing with, but in essence, it's kind of like a good housekeeping seal of approval. A lot of countries like it because they feel that if there has been this process, it is a seal of quality that they can count on. And so it works out well in many instances. It is extremely time-consuming. Another example of where there are programmatic activities doing these things are that as part of the resolutions on smallpox, WHO formally conducts examinations of the 2 smallpox repositories in the world, so one at CDC and one in Vector in Russia. And again, these are formal programmatic activities, but the point I want to make here is that these are activities which are requested by countries, and so they are stood up. Now, a third kind of approach to this sort of issue, and which is one that I get, or was asked in the past many times, can there be a framework approach to this? So, for example, we've already mentioned a little bit about the BWC, the Biologic Weapons Convention. Another kind of framework are the international health regulations. And so certainly these sorts of frameworks are possible. But these are very time-consuming. These are things which usually require years of negotiations to stand up. And if you are really trying to address an issue which is constantly evolving, and probably the science of genetics is something which is constantly evolving, I'm not quite sure it's the right approach to take here. But regardless of all these things, at the international organization level, what's a critical point is that these activities can get addressed if there is member state support. And this is both in terms of visible political support, which is brought up in the assembly or in other fora, as well as the funding needed to carry them out. So, Barry, let me stop there.
Thank you very much. I'd like to make just two brief comments before opening the discussion. One is to say that there has been a remarkable amount of harmonization from the presentations we've heard within Europe. And the question I would ask our panel to respond to is, to what extent is that process open to collaborations and harmonization with stuff that will come from the United States or countries outside of Europe? So that would be my first question, ask you to think about that. And the second, if you look at the slide that I brought, one of the rare examples of international cooperation through WHO has been in this process of pre-qualification of laboratories. So essentially no developing countries, or very few, are prepared to purchase a drug from a company that they don't know anything about, that they don't know is safe. And WHO has set up this process, which is quite elaborate, as you can see from this is the WHO description, of everything including experience of the companies, the site inspection, the issues of conflicts, and if we could have the next one, a little more detail. Could we have the next slide, please? Again, very detailed examination of the commercial laboratories that produce drugs and vaccines. And essentially, the world has bought into the fact that not every company that makes a product can sell them with impunity to any country in the world unless someone has guaranteed the safety and quality of that. And the question is whether that represents an example, if the NSABB wishes to move forward with opening some of the GOF experiments of concern, how does one limit the laboratories to those that one has the greatest confidence would cause the least risk? And would this be seen as a precedent? And those would be my questions. And I would turn to the panel for comments on harmonization with the US and a role for WHO in, with input from all the appropriate countries and agencies, finding a way to make open, transparent to the world and the public what is being done, but being done under conditions that are at the highest quality of safety one can imagine. Volker?
Thank you, Barry. I would say it is certainly very important that Europe and the United States try to find a way in which they can agree on a strategic and concept way to bring maybe different views together. I mean, the United States has its regulations, the European has its regulation. I myself, as European, have a hard time to understand the European regulations. They're very, very complicated. I'm not an insider in your regulations, but I only know it would be very important to bring these things together, and one should find a way in which one have in a simple way the basic, requirements put together and agree on the basic requirements. And all what comes in addition, I think, may be added step by step. But if we start, let's say, with 1,000 pages of the NSABB report, I can see that it will be a hard time, to take this as a basis for finding an agreement. This is my experience of life. So I would say it would be good if we find some sort of a common denominator for things which are essential, and we heard them today, and use this as a first step that Europe and the United States come together, and then I would say we try to invite the others. Because I would say worldwide, this type of experiment is not done in every country. The majority of developing countries cannot do it because they don't have the outfit. So it is important to get these countries together. For example, I represent a network at the present time as co-chair of 130 national academies worldwide. And the majority is called the Inter-Academy Partnership. And it includes science academies, about over 100, and medical academies, about around 25 worldwide. And it would be probably worthwhile, to bring them together on the table, which we have, and find out in which country are these experiments done. Then start after Europe and the United States have found an agreement, bring them together and eventually get an agreement which, from the science academies' point of view would be acceptable because they have a much better connection to their own government than we at the outside would have to the government. And this would be a way I could think to go forward. But I agree it would be important that we do these steps.
I think we have a plan. Other comments?
Yes, so in Europe, we do have now a push to deregulation, in fact. Or to better regulation. So on one hand, very many of the member states are complaining of the complexity of the system and the fact that a lot of regulations have been piling up and nothing disappeared. On the other hand, in these newer fields of activity, there is a call to better work together and to find a common framework. So at least in the area of biomedical research and innovation, we are moving more and more, not only in Europe, but together with the international partners on some type of voluntary frameworks where we are deciding, in fact, on some guiding principles and everyone can adhere if they want, and they are not obliged if they don't. We are taking it really step by step. We have been very successful in working with the colleagues from the United States, in particular with the NIH, but some other federal agencies in multiple areas, including, so I'll give an example. We have an international consortium in work in rare diseases, and I know that is much less controversial, but we have 40 different funding agencies in that particular consortium. We had agreed on a common framework, including very sensitive issues such as data sharing and biosample sharing from a population which is immediately identifiable. And all the funding agencies adhered to those principles. Projects are funded by each individual funding agency, but all the researchers are pledging to follow those particular guidance. And I think that keeping it inclusive, but in the same time flexible, it was the key of success for these international initiatives.
Silja?
Yes. I think in regard to the openness of the process for a suggestion from the US, I have stressed very much the biosecurity side. I think on the biosafety side, we have a very robust framework in Germany. And therefore, I'm not quite sure how much the US could influence it. On the other hand, I would agree with you, Volker, Meulen, that if we have a very clear outcome in regard to the gain-of-function studies of concern, in regard to the risk-benefit, even the biosafety side could be informed, I think, in Germany, and biosecurity in every case. So I think it's very important what will be the outcome of this discussion here. In regard to the pre-qualifications of laboratories by the WHO and the question of harmonization, I think the harmonization of laboratory safety standards is very, very important. And I think an international kind of framework or inspection mechanism would be very feasible. However, the question is in regard to gain-of-function studies of concern, what does it mean? Does it mean that every laboratory which is safe according to these rules is allowed to do this kind of studies without any case-to-case evaluation of the certain experiment? And then I would say, I don't know, because we are thinking about risk-benefit, and it's not only about laboratory safety. So I think it's an important first step for harmonization. I think it would be important in regard to gain-of-function studies of concern to have the highest safety level, but I nevertheless think we have still think whether there are questions of substantial rules on gain-of-function studies of concern and whether there are some limits to them or not.
Keiji?
So, Barry, I'll restrict myself to the second question. I think pre-qualification works for a couple of reasons. You have countries that very much want it. You have the target are products which in general are stable. If you are making some kind of medicine or vaccine, it's not going to change very often. And so you have a process, you have a set routine that you can go through and ask, what's the GMP process and so on and so on. And so you can have a very nice approach to that. I think gain-of-function assessments are an order of magnitude more complicated. The experiments for influenza are not necessarily going to be the same as they would be for another organism. The laboratories will be different, and researcher interests will come up at one time or another, and funding over a limited period of time is very much an issue, so moving. And I would guess at any time in the world there may be some hundreds of such laboratories which could be looked at. And so I think that operationally, it would be extremely, extremely difficult for the organization. I think that it's this kind of discussion came up after the 2012, 2013 period when those meetings, and I think that, to be blunt, much of WHO's response was to say these really should be done at a national level, at a global level. For any organization to handle that level of activity would be very taxing. Very difficult.
Terrific. Floor is open for questions and discussion. Question here?
Yes, hi. My name is Gavin Huntley-Fenner. I'm a human factors risk analysis consultant, and I have a question regarding pre-qualification of labs. I was wondering if you could talk about the relative merits of going through WHO versus going through an organization like ISO, particularly vis-a-vis looking at consistent standards across academic and industrial labs, and whether you feel there might be a benefit to go one way versus the other. Maybe one might support the other. What are your thoughts about that?
Sure. I can be very blunt here. I think that the reason why WHO can pull this off is that countries trust WHO. And so this is what we find consistently, particularly when we're dealing with lower and middle income countries. And so if another organization which has even greater capacities perhaps is doing it, there's always a kind of question, is this really being done in a neutral way? And so I think that WHO could certainly work through or have other people come in and perhaps contractors come in but it would have to be done very much as a WHO activity, in my opinion, having dealt with a lot of countries and these sorts of issues.
Thank you. Harvey.
Oh, thank you. I'm Harvey Feinberg from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. I'm thinking of how different countries approve drugs and medical devices. Here, where we have relatively high standards in many countries, nevertheless, the experience teaches that occasionally, even regularly, some countries will approve a given drug or device. Other countries will not yet approve it. Sometimes there is a matter of many years, and maybe indefinitely, between the approvals in one country or another. And that's an instance in which the standards are relatively clear, the measurements are relatively straightforward, and the decision-making is through a well-established process. The gain-of-function situation, in a sense, has higher stakes because it would not be good for the world if one country would approve a given experiment and another country will not. It is much different than if one country approves a given drug for a period of time compared to a second. And the mechanisms to establish, recognize, and carry out and implement these standards are much less clear-cut, and we have much less experience. So with that, my question, challenge to the board, really to all of us, is how could we take concrete steps over time to enhance the likelihood that there will be, in fact, harmonized standards, applications, and decision-making in different countries for gain-of-function research?
I think that the likelihood is relatively small in the short term, and this is because, as we've heard here today, we are not agreeing on a definition. We have also listened in the previous session at a number of examples which have been considered case by case, where by and large they might have entered into the category of a gain of function. But they were considered as being, if you're looking at the risk-benefit analysis, quite safe. So, and that is a matter of interpretation. It is also a matter of being based on a specific legislative system. And as you have pointed out, the differences, for instance, in the drug or device approval are in part stemming from these very different legislative processes. Thus, at least from my experience, from the European experience, this voluntary harmonization, which was the basis of the creation of the European Medicinal Agency. Before, each of the national agencies were approving the drugs one by one in each individual country. At least that assessment step now is done in common at the European level. Now we've moved to the next step. Are we going to be able to assess at least partially in common, so the health technology assessment? We are not even talking about the payers and the reimbursement. So I would look at your question as a step-by-step approach. If we could agree on some general framework and some general principles and definitions, maybe we can actually move then. Next step.
Volker?
Well, Harvey, I think that an agreement between scientists about biosafety on the gain-of-function experiment will be relatively easy. I think that, well, this is a small group here and a small group in Europe doing these type of experiments, have the expertise. I think they will come together quite fast. Then, of course, the biosecurity and going in this area, there, of course, probably the discussion will be longer. But at the end, I would envision that it's relatively easy to find an agreement. The question will be whether we can convince our legal institutions we have and our ministries and our complicated European arrangement of finding solutions, whether they would follow us. But I would say if the scientists of Europe and the United States who are doing these experiments and know each other will come up and develop a concept, I think this is the first step which should be done. I would say from there on, I'm quite optimistic that we can step by step develop it. The questions which I have is if we try to do it more globally, to go into other countries, then I would say this would be more complicated, but the first step would be an agreement between the US and the EU. If this is not achievable, we have no chance globally. But if we can achieve this, I think, and I'm quite positive, it would be the first important step to do.
Silja?
Yes, I think so as well, because I think there are some structural advantages we have here in this field of gain-of-function studies of concern, because it's not so much the private sector, it's more research done at universities, and the research is financed by the taxpayer in the end, so we have less market forces, I think, in this area, and therefore I think we could have agreement, and I still dream of a UNESCO WHO soft law declaration. I don't know what the WHO thinks about it, but I think we could agree on the main principle, perhaps, on the risk-benefit, link it perhaps to human rights, and have a framework. And this should be done together with the scientists. So, for instance, UNESCO declarations were first drafted by the scientists, and then the state representatives came in. So we could bring both together, politics and science. I don't know. I hope still.
Well, Harvey, this is, I think, how I look at it. I think that, resolutions don't have the power of, they're not binding treaties, they're not regulation. I think that resolutions are perhaps possible, but I think in this area it's still a little bit difficult because I don't think there are enough countries that would be engaged on the issue in terms of and then I think regulations is certainly a step which is harder. I think that if the United States and Europe were to agree, that would be difficult, but I think that to throw that open more broadly on a global level would be very difficult. The way I think about this issue is a little bit how I think about infection prevention and control. We have guidelines which are sound. They're well known. We have a great need for it, and it's terrible in most places in the world. It's not implemented at a very high level. And I think one of the missing ingredients is that there are cultural issues, and here we have the culture of scientists. I think peer-to-peer pressure in this kind of area is very strong, and I think that the scientists themselves know better than anybody what others are doing and whether they think that it's risky or not. So for myself, I believe that much of the ability to handle this issue comes from whether the scientific culture is that these experiments are really not acceptable unless there's a very good reason for it, which is justifiable. I think publications have a role to play in developing this kind of culture. So for me, it seems to be that would be, in many ways, how you get to where I think we all want it to go.
Thank you. This side, this time?
So Harvey had set up most of my question for me, so I'll take it farther based on our international experience taking care of patients.
Tell us who you are.
It's Michael Callahan, Mass General Hospital. I ran DARPA's biodefense program for 8 years, which launched a series of international clinical trials programs for emergency use against highly dangerous pathogens. The point is this, is that there's a dramatic shift in the revenue potential of the Asian Rim for the development of new antivirals and antimicrobials. A huge number of those drugs, we counted 64 in China, are never intended for U.S. licensure, but they're evoking resistance patterns for agents that we are seeing in our hospitals. Pan-carbapenemase resistant, neuraminidase resistant against antivirals that we don't even have in our stockpile and can't prescribe for. So there is actually, I think, a greater need to understand the motivation for that. And when you ask how these companies are being supported, they're being supported by in-country by venture capital. And their intention is to keep those profits and those markets secured in Asia, where the people are, which has a dramatically expanding middle-income population and which does self-pay. So as the demographics changes, I think we have to pivot with it in terms of understanding how you're going to capture the market incentives driving the forcible gain of function to get a winning compound that's still going to be effective against an antiviral or antibacterial landscape that's highly resistant with FDA-approved drugs. So forcing gain of function is largely, in our experience, working extensively in Asia, taking care of patients at the premier infectious disease referral centers in Asia, is being driven by mid-sized biotech funded by regional venture capital with no intention, again, to proceed with FDA regulatory review. So how would you suggest that we engage the commercial sector and the venture sector in a way that can help us at least get situational awareness of the drugs that are driving resistance when we have so little in our arsenal? It's decreasing every year. I know it's a tough problem, but Harvey taking the first part of the problem away from us. So what are your thoughts?
Please.
So in Europe, we do have the largest public-private partnership in the world. It's called the Innovative Medicine Initiative. It is a partnership between the European Pharmaceutical Industry and Association and the European Commission. And it's very interesting that you're pointing out this issue of antimicrobial resistance, because the biggest of the platforms is in fact dedicated to antimicrobial resistance. In the various projects entering there, so again, it's half and half. BARDA is contributing to one of the programs, but one of the projects is looking at new business models where there are no incentives. Another one is setting up international clinical trial sites when you have your drugs and you have a certain target. We have sites in 46 countries, about 300 and something clinical trial sites. I think that the incentives are not only that the public side, so ourselves, we are putting half of the money, but we have found a modality where the various enterprises are incentivized to work with each other. So this program, which is called New Drugs for Bed Bugs, is a program of 790 million euros that, in fact, is shared between the industry and the public funders. So that's one model. I know that, I know that one of the sponsors of the meeting is a Wellcome Trust. We are working together with them and with the NIH, with our friends, the Canadian, with others, in establishing also a global network for preparedness for emerging epidemics. It's called GLOPID-R. In fact, the meeting is going to be here in Washington next week, the 14th and the 15th. So while I don't say that we have the magic bullet, and I'm talking about the global community, I think that there is a lot of work in both incentivizing the industry to participate, finding new funding models and the business models, and actually working together globally to tackle some of these issues.
Last two questions, first on that side.
So it's not a question, it's a comment. I start by thanking all the panelists for their comments. I'm Piers Millett from Biosecure. I just wanted to take this opportunity to reflect the views of the large part of the world not reflected in this meeting. In particular, to just convey to you a couple of short paragraphs from 112 states in a statement made pretty much every year to the Biological Weapons Convention, specifically on the issues of this meeting. And the statement reads that the non-aligned movement, on whose behalf this is made, notes that there have been recent advances demonstrating the increasing sophistication of synthetic biology together with other enabling technologies which have benefits, together with the potential for uses contrary to the Biological Weapons Convention. Now, all states must conduct such activities in a transparent manner, in order to build the confidence of other states. There is a need to regulate these activities to ensure they do not lead to any concerns related to the ethics, safety, and security, as well as any other uses contrary to international law. That has assumed added importance in the light of reports concerning experiments that have taken place on highly contagious, virulent flu strains like H5N1, as well as the production of several new strains of viruses that are both contagious and more deadly than the 1918 flu that killed almost 50 million people worldwide. Such regulation must, however, be undertaken in a manner that does not hamper scientific and technological developments that are in keeping with the spirit and letter of the Biological Weapons Convention, which are of benefit, most especially, to developing countries. So those are the views of at least 112 countries on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gao.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, George Gao from China CDC and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. I also have two comments. I think the first one, I want to make a support for, really either WHO-led or EU-led regulation for this GOF, because think about it, especially for the influenza virus research. I mean, the technique is not that high anymore. So, any lab, like in a lot of developing countries, they can just do genetic modified influenza virus so easy. So you'll never know what happened with the reassortment and your recombination. For example, in China, we have a national kind of a regulation from the Ministry of Health. You are not allowed to mix any, two viruses together. So in case, especially for the influenza virus, you have a reassortment occurs. So I think we need a UN or WHO-led regulation like that, because the technique is not that high anymore. And my second comment, I was just about to give for the last session. I think we have been discussing this panel and last panel the whole day about the policy making. But I think the oversight or supervision of the process are also very important. So you have a policy, you have the regulation, who will be the supervisor to guide or to really to do the survey for any experiment and the whole process. I think at least as far as I know, and in China, this process, because they are scientists are human beings, so you need someone or some watchdog to really oversee or supervise the whole process to make sure, the regulation is really there. That's my two comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to express my appreciation to a fantastic panel who's really thought long and hard, and that they could come to the degree of consensus within 28 different countries in Europe, I think should give us hope that we can reconcile, as has been suggested, policies that this government will ultimately recommend here. I think the point that we just heard on the need for a universal consensus, I would point out that the big problem that was raised with the Biologic Weapons Convention is that there is no enforcement. There is no enforcement. The enforcement is just what we heard, the collegial interactions of science, the development of a scientific consensus, and to the extent possible being open about what scientists are doing, has had the constraining power to keep work, at least that we know about, in biological weapons under control that was not really thought of in 1972. So getting to consensus at the scientific level is one step for moving forward to international consensus on this kind of work. With that, I thank everybody for their attention and questions, and I believe we have refreshments. Is that right? Thank you.